All right, I think I'm going to get this festivity started. First of all, thank you for showing up at oh my God hour in the morning. At the end of the conference, you're probably worn to a frazzle. So if I see your head go back and your eyes roll back in your head, I'm not going to take it personally. So my name's Eric Hibbard, and if you've been to any other security sessions, you've probably figured out that I'm deeply entrenched in the security space, have been for a while, wear a bunch of different hats. All these letters after my name, this is about half of the letters. These are different kinds of security, privacy, auditing credentials, and that's kind of where I'm coming from. So I'm one of these weird security people that have sort of delved into the storage world to try and understand two very different kinds of technologies. This session, and since it's a cozy number of people, feel free to if you have particular interests, feel free to ask questions. I'm happy to share. There are some interesting things happening in the product security certification space, which is why I propose this. This is not intended to be a deep dive on any one of the particular certifications, but to help you as a developer understand that if you're going to encounter one of these at some point, you want to start early in sort of the thinking process and strategy process. And this is to just kind of help trigger, these are the kind of things that you need to basically worry about. But if you want to do a deep dive on some of this, I can probably help. I've actually had to do common criteria certifications. I'm doing multiple Fips 140 certifications. I've been involved in writing the standards that all of those are based on, and you'll see that there's some changes. So, I may be able to field a fair amount of what might be interest. Okay, so this is a legal notice. I'm not a lawyer. I play the part of the lawyer. I'm not your consultant. Pays your money, takes your chances. It's all on you. Okay, so as a background, there's been an interesting dynamic for a while. I've worked in the vendor space now for probably 16 years of my 40-year career. The rest of the time was as a data center manager. I used to run supercomputer facilities for NASA and Department of Energy. So I have lots of data center background going back to the 70s. So as a consumer of technology, there's a dynamic where we don't trust what the vendor says. Prove it. And in the case of security, quite some time ago, there were some formalization of certification programs. And coming out of that was ultimately common criteria, which is based on the ISO 15408 standard. But there's also, in the case of the US government, wanting to make sure that any cryptography implementations used to protect government information is also done correctly. Lots of examples where somebody invented an encryption algorithm that turned out to be little more than an encoding algorithm and was easily broken by a 5-year-old. So this is all under the heading of we understand what you're saying, prove it, run the gauntlet. And we are seeing a trend right now, especially in Europe, where that's likely to become even more important. So don't be surprised in the not too distant future, if you want to sell in the EU, you may actually, and there's a security aspect to your product, you may actually have to hold a certification for the product. That is a problem because many of these certifications are very, very focused on make and model, firmware version. If you touch it, it's no longer a certified product. So there's a maintenance element of this that can be a real nightmare. So you really have to think through your strategy and sort of understand some of the dynamics, or you can go broke trying to keep your certifications current, and we see that a lot. Paul?
Are you talking about products that are specifically manufactured in the EU?
No. You want to sell it in the EU. Yeah. Or use it. Right. And there's even discussion around doing this with consumer grade. I had a call this morning. I was talking with a bunch of Europeans about some of these activities, and there's a general recognition that just having a certified product doesn't solve all the problems, but they're basically taking the position of, well, we got to start somewhere, and if we can build on a set of certified products, then that's a starting point that we don't have today. And so they're pretty aggressively moving in a direction to kind of deal with this. In the U.S., it's these are, with the exception of Fips 140, optional. As a vendor, they're optional for you to do them. It's just whether you want to do business with the U.S. government or not. If you got encryption and you want to sell to the U.S., it's not Fips certified. Thank you for sharing. Go away. Kind of attitude. Okay, so we are seeing around the globe this interest in certified products. If you work with folks in Singapore, they're pretty interested in certification. They've actually cooked up their own in the past. We see, definitely give you an example. There's an activity underway right now to do consumer IoT labeling in that if your product passes a certain set of criteria, that you get a stamp. It's like, an EL, Underwriters Lab, little label on a power cord in the US. And so the Singapore folks already have a program in place for consumer IoT, and they proposed it as a way to do this internationally. US is looking at a similar kind of program. There's an executive order from the Biden administration. NIST has gone out, created some criteria, and right now there's an effort to go off and do this. So this is not just sort of data center enterprise class kind of stuff. We're seeing baby toys that have an IT element of it, if you will, a networking element. So it's going to be, I think, a fact of life that we have to confront. Okay, so and certain sectors like healthcare, already in the U.S. under HIPAA, certain networking devices are already required to have certain kinds of certifications in place. And if you are a healthcare provider and you're not using the right equipment, if you get audited, or God help you if you have a data breach, that gives them the criteria for which, so you didn't meet the minimum, big fine. And that's how a lot of this stuff gets played out. All right, so from a vendor perspective, these certifications, although somewhat painful, can actually be helpful because they will help you understand a minimum set of requirements that you've got to basically deal with, at least from a security perspective, possibly from a privacy perspective, since there is some crossover. Okay. So why, what are we dealing with? Well, I think if you're familiar with security anyway, this landscape, the threat landscape is constantly changing. It's a cat and mouse game. The security professionals are the mouse. The bad guys are the cat. We are not winning this battle. If anybody tells you otherwise, they lie. We are not winning. So you really do need to do what you can to protect yourself, protect your organization. Lots of problems with supply chain. Again, these certifications play into this because you're trying to demonstrate trust, and a certification is a way of saying, we make these claims, we have this capability, it's been vetted by a third party. The legal community in the US is, and I can attest to this, I sit on the American Bar Association's Cybersecurity Legal Task Force. I'm a co-chair of the ABA's IoT committee, and I sit on the section of Science and Technology Law Council. So I have quality time with lawyers on a regular basis. They are watching. They are on a first name basis with the FTC. I know the top 3 lawyers in the FTC, spoke with them this week. And unfair and deceptive practices is the tool of choice. Those fines can range hundreds of thousands of dollars if you get hit with something like that. So this is, not to be fooled with. Okay, so I've already sort of hinted that there's a couple of certification programs, but we'll talk about some other stuff as well. But the thing to keep in mind is these two, Fips 140 and Common Criteria, both changed in 2022. So as of April of this year, there's a brand new Fips 140-3. Not brand new, but all new submissions as of April must be 140-3. Pretty big change. And Common Criteria, the 15408 and its companion, the 18045, so 15408 is a 5-part, previously a 3-part standard. It was published in the last month, and the 18045 was also published in the last month. So what this means is the laboratories and the consultants, the whole community that's around these, are having to adjust to a fairly radical change in both of these programs. And that means takes more time, means if you knew how to do this before, you don't now. So it's not one of these, well, A became B and C became A, adjustment. There's pretty significant changes in the approaches, right? So besides all the threat landscape kind of stuff that you have to worry about, which factors into these certifications, you now have the criteria which are being looked at have also changed. Okay, so I'm gonna do a sort of crop dusting of these two. So you at a bare minimum could differentiate Common Criteria and Fips 140, and then just kind of highlight some things. The idea is that when you think about these, there's sort of mental mode that you need to sort of slip into when you're thinking about them. All right, so when we talk about Common Criteria, the program is quite extensive. These are run at the national level, and then there are mutual recognition agreements between different nations. There are consuming nations, and then there are certifying nations, and all kinds of other elements. So the players in the Common Criteria world include the developers and the product vendors, which may or may not be the same thing. So you might actually have developers that are building components and being put together underneath the product vendor. You've got certifiers and evaluators. Consumers play a role in that. They may actually require that a product be certified at a particular level and include certain kinds of requirements that are defined in like protection profiles. Approvers and accreditors. In the United States, approvers would be NIST and Canadian organization that formed NIAP. They're also the accreditors for the laboratories. So if you want to get Common Criteria in basically North America, NIAP is who would ultimately issue the certification, but the laboratories are basically the ones that will do the evaluations of products. So this is an ecosystem that when there's a change, that ripples through all of these players. And we are in the midst of one of these right now. The kickoff has just happened. So if you are about to engage on one of these, I wish you well. It's likely to be a little challenging as these adjustments happen. So there are some core security concepts and relationships, and interesting enough, these apply to, in many ways, to the formal certification as well as maybe some informal kinds of things. So if you're familiar with an organization like OCP, there are hints of a process for reviewing a product, but it's not a formal process, and they haven't necessarily endorsed something like common criteria. But these are the kind of things that you need to worry about. So you're worrying about things like threat agents and threats and the impacts they have on assets, and as owners worrying about controls and the risks that those that come to bear. And again, everything flows down to assets. And assets could be money, could be data, could be systems. And so the basic structure here is this relationship. And when you think about, from a security perspective, any sort of evaluation program, this model is actually a reasonable one to keep in mind, because you are going to have to worry about who are we trying to protect against? Who are the threat agents? What are the threats? What sort of vulnerabilities do we have to worry about? And then what are the risks? I mean, if it's just a cafeteria menu, you're not really going to worry too much about it. But if you're hosting, financial services information or healthcare information, then the risk can be quite high. So this model is actually straight out of the 15408 Part 1, which deals with with concepts. But it's one that we've used within SNIA over the years to sort of talk about these various components and the relationships they have. It's pretty simplistic, but what I've seen is a lot of developers aren't necessarily thinking about this facet of a product, and really this is intended to. This should be in the back of your mind when you're developing something. There's sort of another sort of view, and this one comes from sort of an owner perspective. And this is showing you how the evaluation, the certification kind of program kind of plays into things. So the whole idea is that if there's been an evaluation, that it's going to basically build on confidence or trust, for those owners, and the confidence comes out of, are the controls sufficient and correct to mitigate or address whatever kind of risks that you're worried about to whatever kind of assets you have. That's the sort of the layman way of describing this. And so as a vendor, you're trying to convince your consumers that your product is not going to expose their assets to inappropriate amounts of risk. So if you are making claims that you secure the communications channel, for example, and that's important for a particular customer, and you've implemented SSL 3.0 as the mechanism to secure that channel, that does not pass the giggle test, given that TLS 1.3 would be the expected mechanism. If you go through some sort of evaluation as a vendor and you basically say SSL 3.0 as our solution, I can guarantee you will fail that certification. You will not get the cert because it just does not pass muster. So this is the kind of thing where an owner may not be able to actually detail all of the security requirements that they really want, and a certification program helps them understand, okay, so you certified against these criteria. This is the kind of stuff that I need to have in my product, okay? Okay, so common criteria, this is the quiz part, is based on the entire product. So you'll hear the targeted evaluation, but it's an entire product. And this is different from Fips 140. It's very configuration specific. If you change the firmware as part of the target evaluation or any of the software or even hardware components, that new flavor of the product is not certified. So there's a maintenance program to allow you to deal with that. And non-security changes are much easier to deal with than those that are part of the security. So, well, why would you care about this? Well, it means if you've got a product that's in early stages and you're doing rapid changes, adjustments, patches, it's probably not an ideal candidate to pursue common criteria certification. And to give you an idea, there are these evaluation assurance levels. They get more difficult as you go up, but the lowest level, EAL1 as it's called, for a moderately complex product, you could reasonably expect to spend $250,000 on it. And if you have to go through a revision of that, that could be anywhere from $90,000 to another $250,000. And you don't want to be doing, and it can take you anywhere from 3 months to 2 years to run this gauntlet. So, and it's definitely a paper tiger that will consume resources. So you want to be very strategic about how you and when you engage these things. So keep in mind, make and model is critical. So I've seen vendors will go through the certification program on a configuration that they're basically freezing and moving to sort of like a next gen, and then they'll go after a certification of that piece that they know is going to be fairly stable. And part of it allows them to say, well, this product has common criteria certification. There's a marketing spin that basically is done on it. So timing of this stuff can be very, very important. There are aspects of the environment, so assumptions that one basically makes statements about. Years ago, there was an operating system that got a very high level of certification for common criteria. And part of the reason that that was possible is a stated assumption on the environment is the network is not a threat. If you were to do that today, it would not fly. But back then, it actually exploited a little loophole in the requirements. So how, the environment, the expected environment that a product is going to operate is something that actually gets documented. As a vendor, you make your own claims for the most part. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a separate certification. You don't get, so if you had, a vendor XYZ and vendor ABC, XYZ does a certification, and ABC basically pulls the label off and puts their label on. From a certification, common criteria certification perspective, they are two separate entities. Now that's the bad news. The good news is, because the product has already run the gauntlet, ABC is going to have a much easier time getting the certification, because you're going to basically submit the whole package, change the names, and for the most part, Yeah, so it might take you, 18 months to get the first one. You might actually be able to get the second vendors in a matter of a couple of months. But again, this is a strategic thing where if you've got that going on, you probably want to be talking with, your partner in terms of, so who actually is going to own, who's going to eat the original certification? Because it does chew up resources. The company that would be basically putting the label on probably doesn't have the internal documentation that's going to be required, and so it'll actually kind of play out fairly cleanly in terms of who does it. And it's possible that, in my example, XYZ might just repeat the certification and say, oh yeah, we just got another label on this thing. So, but that's the kind of thing that, from a strategy standpoint, you want to think about it, because you can imagine a situation where it's basically the same product. You don't want to get into a situation where, well, maybe you do, where the one with the certification has a competitive advantage because it has the cert, whereas the other one doesn't. That might not be viewed favorably by the other partner. As I said, you as a vendor get to basically describe what the requirements are. Then you just basically have to prove it. That's what the evaluation process is. Where the customer comes into play, and we definitely see this with governments, is they might want to see a certain set of requirements included in your evaluation. And so these things called protection profiles and collaborative protection profiles. So protection profiles go through a formal certification program themselves. Collaborative protection profiles are put together by groups, individuals. I can tell you right now, IEEE is looking at doing a collaborative protection profile around sanitization. So the new, if you participated in the session yesterday where we talked about the IEEE 2883, that working group is now looking at, is it possible for us to draft up a collaborative protection profile? And what that is a set of criteria. So any product that would be certified against a collaborative protection profile, they've at least got a core set of requirements. It's consistent across that various vendor offerings. So it's definitely in, from a consumer perspective, an advantage to have this minimum set. So you're doing apples to apples comparison for the security, or maybe another way of saying it, this is the minimum set of security they want to ensure that's part of the product. And you're asking for the certification and the inclusion of these protection profiles and CPPs. So the evaluation and testing is performed by third parties. So these are accredited laboratories. It's just not anybody. It's accredited. I actually did one a few years ago where a customer was demanding it, and they also had an accredited laboratory. And I did something kind of evil. I used their accredited laboratory. And there's basically a firewall between the two different halves of the organization, but it was a very fun dynamic. if going through a certification program is fun. But there are lots of options. So you want to be careful about which laboratories you select. Some have different success rates. So you probably want to shop a little bit. I can tell labs in the US tend to be a little rougher because NIST tends to be rougher on them. I've seen that the Canadian labs, you might have difficulty with one of the US labs, and a Canadian lab might let you slide a little bit. But so you want to look around and not just lock in a particular lab. And the results from the evaluation and the testing are basically sent to the scheme owner. In the US, that's NIAP. And they're the ones that basically issue the certification. There is a mutual recognition agreement that's in place. It currently only applies at EAL1, which historically has been considered a marketing cert. So if you're looking for a certification that's got legs internationally, again, that's something to pay attention to. So and this is a result of some things that the U.S. did a few years ago. They almost killed the Common Criteria program. And they were unhappy with some of the results. So this was a bit of a dumbing down of the mutual recognition agreement. The other thing that we're seeing is these CPPs can be regional. So you could actually have a CPP that's developed by the Europeans, and the U.S. might not accept it as part of its scheme, so you have to pay attention to it. Whereas protection profiles, because they go through the certification, they're generally recognized across all the countries. And I said before, changes to product, can force a recertification. This is a real problem because if you're trying to keep your product patched, so you apply the patch and it's no longer a certified product. And this is something that the Common Criteria community has been wrestling with for a while. And there have been some changes in the new version to kind of help deal with this approach. Okay, so this is sort of a pictorial, what's part of Fips 140-3. So as a starting point, Fips 140-3 is focused on basically the encryption aspects or the cryptographic aspects of a product. Not necessarily the whole product. You could do the whole product, or because of your design, you may be forced to do the whole product. But that introduces some challenges because it, again, changed the label on the, so if we're talking like an SSD, if you do a drive level Fips 140 certification, change the label on the drive, recertify the drive. Now the process, security versus non-security changes, that's accounted for, but still, I'm being a bit facetious, but you get the idea. Whereas if you're careful in how you've designed your cryptography, it's in a sort of a module that you can clearly say this is in, this is out of the cryptographic piece. Then the level of complexity in the certification go down quite a bit, and what you may have to recertify and how much time and energy it takes can definitely be simplified. So this is one of those things, especially for Fips 140-3, you want to pay attention to. And this is probably relevant to a lot of the storage vendors because they have encryption's pretty much a core capability, whether it's in flight or at rest. So localizing, containing is, from a design perspective, is fairly important. But as you can see, these are all parts of it. So you've got the module specification, the interfaces. So how does the outside commute with the inside, from a boundary perspective? Depending on the level of the certification, you might actually have things like role-based access control. So that might be like a privacy officer versus a user. So at low levels, you don't worry about it. At higher levels, those become important. Firmware and the software that's involved, are a factor. And you may have multiple levels of firmware that you're dealing with. You may have purchased a crypto chip from somebody that you're integrating in as part of your crypto module. So you may have to account for their software and your software, and any of those changes, can be a challenge. You got to be able to deal with self-tests. Yep. So historically, software can only get Fips certification at level 1. You can't, because you can't put tamper evidence on the the software piece of it. I mean, you could sign it, but that doesn't necessarily, that's not tamper evidence. And as you go up, it gets even nastier. So yeah, if you're doing any kind of software, So for example, common tools for like TLS, you'll see that they'll go for a Fips certification, but it'll be a level 1. Yeah, and that's not really changed in the new version. Some of the requirements have gotten a little nastier, and it's usually a subset of their code. They're really trying to say, we're only going to certify this little tiny piece, not the whole set of libraries. Okay. On both common criteria and Fips 140, because of past vendor indiscretion, they are allowed to consider any and all available information on vulnerabilities and attacks and whatnot. So if you come walking in thinking that the laboratory is not aware, you will be quickly abused. They are very skilled at watching what's happening in the world. So if you've got CVEs against your product, I can guarantee you they'll be going like this. And how did you take care of those, or do those apply? And so don't walk in kind of naive and think you're going to escape, because these folks are very aware. There are aspects of physical security in this. So I've actually been in a situation where we had a controller board in a product, and we shipped the product for encryption. We eventually got a Fips certification, and we had to ship a special kit to the customers that want Fips certified product. And the kit basically included a piece of tape that went over. So somebody had to basically slide the drawer out, put the tape across the slide the drawer back in. But because that was the okay, so it was the tamper evident seal that was necessary for that particular level. So there's things like that happen where if you're, again, timing wise, you may, we'll work on it, and then as a retrofit, you got to figure out, depending on what level you're at, what does that mean? Do we have to go in and for those products that have already shipped, or do you just abandon them? You don't try to actually move them into the certified suite. Okay, so as you can see, there's quite a bit involved with these certifications, and your documentation and your processes have to basically deal with all of these components in the certification program. All right, so this is really, it can be, Fips 140-3 can be at the product level. I would say be very careful about doing that, because there's a lot of things that, from a manufacturing perspective, your suppliers may need to change. So you're buying memory from somebody, you're buying cache from somebody, you're buying FPGAs from somebody, and that somebody runs out of stock, or if you're multi-sourcing, like many companies are multi-sourcing, one line might be certified, the other one might not be. So this is the kind of stuff that if you're doing product level, this becomes a consideration. If it's just the crypto module, then that becomes a much less of an issue, as long as it's non-security pieces, right? The requirements for Fips 140, unlike common criteria where you get to specify them, plus anything else that comes in with these protection profiles, these requirements are very explicit. They're well documented. And every time there's a discovery by a laboratory on, that issue's not been addressed, there's usually some follow-up decisions that get made and captured. So Fips 140 is much clearer in terms of what you've got to address. So the upfront work for you can be, definitely more detailed. As I said, again, third-party labs, they have to be accredited labs. Many of the labs that do common criteria will also do Fips 140. Not necessarily surprised, because in the past, If you were doing common criteria and you had encryption as part of that, you might end up having to deal with a Fips 140 certification, especially in the US. The scheme owners in the US are NIST and CSEC. CSEC is the Canadian organization. Most people are familiar with NIST if you're wondering what that is. So it's a collaborative arrangement. And the NSA is sort of lurking in the shadows on the NIST side. So, just to be aware. And again, tweak the product. You're facing a recertification. The 140-3 is now based on ISO 19790, and then the 24759 are used for these derived tests. This was a way of addressing this is a US certification. So now based on international standards, there was actually a disconnect for a while. The 19790 is actually based on, for a while, it was actually a different flavor of Fips 140 from what NIST was actually using. The twist is that the US and Canada actually replaced some of the criteria. So there's the ISO standards, and then NIST in Canada basically say, well, actually, we're going to replace this part of it. So if you're getting a Fips 140 certification overseas, and you're planning on using it with the US government or Canada, you do need to be careful that the right criteria were used as part of the evaluation process. So you can, for example, in Japan, get a Fips 140 certification, and it can be accepted by NIST, but you could also get the 19790 certification with a different set of criteria. Okay, some important considerations. System security engineering practices can be important for both of these. In the case of higher level certifications, you might actually have to expose not only your development process, but you might actually have to expose source code. So as these things get more and more serious, you have to expose more and more of the code. Vulnerability reports, so things that have shown up in the past, they will be considered by the labs. Documentation is huge. The amount of paperwork that gets produced for this stuff is massive. A huge amount of it is under NDA. It's never made public, but you have to be very cognizant of what you expose because you may not want your secret sauce to be visible, but you might actually have to show some of that as part of the certification process. So I call it, basically, these are paper tigers, and if you're not prepared to produce the amount of documentation that's necessary, you're doomed from the start. Stated assumptions, they got to pass the giggle test. Otherwise, you'll get laughed out fairly quickly. Most of these programs now actually have sort of pre-meetings just to make sure you're clued into what you're potentially engaging. The testing is critical, so you may have to explain to the lab how you go about testing a certain feature. Your question? Yeah, it sucks to be you. If the lab catches it, they will undoubtedly ask you about it. Yeah. Well, the fun part is if you're in the middle of a certification, you can, depending on kind of what stage you're at. So if you haven't completed all the testing, or you haven't completed the testing associated with whatever you've got to adjust, yeah, you may be okay. Whereas if you've completed the testing, this happens, you make a change, then you may have to repeat the testing. Yeah, so what happens is you're running along, and I've seen where you might start with an initial product, and then what ultimately gets certified might be 3 revs down the road, because you may have repeated some aspect of the testing. Yeah, this testing piece is critical, because if you make certain claims, and it's impossible to test it or prove what you're claiming, you may be doomed from the start. And I got caught in one of those situations where a customer required It had to do with sanitization, interesting enough. We had to be able to prove, beyond a shadow of doubt, that the data had basically been zeroed. And there was no test kit that we could find that would allow access to that particular storage device so that we could go down and show. And we were looking at things like, so could we use an electron microscope to go, and it suddenly got really silly because it was a very low level cert, and it was like an EAL1, and we're like, oh, why are we wasting money on this? And we abandoned it. So knowing what you've got to test and how to go about doing it, labs usually know how to do this, but not always. So certifications may become mandatory. I've said this earlier. We're seeing in the EU, if you're dealing with the US government, Fips 140 is required for any crypto protecting US government information. We're definitely seeing reasonable security turning into, well, if you've got a certification, you might have actually checked that box. So again, this is a way of kind of dealing with some of the requirements. There's some other certifications, 27001, PCI. These are not product certifications. As somebody says, is your product PCI certified? Is it 27001 certified? I would encourage you to laugh hysterically, not in their presence, but it basically means they have no clue. This is organizational security. However, in both of these, they could have a ripple effect. If you're having to go into these environments, it may actually necessitate certain security capabilities, and then because that capability is there, it'll need to be part of the certification. And so, so these are two instances. I've personally had customers say, well, is your product PCI DSS certified? And I'm like, pardon me. And then that was just make sure you're awake. Then you like, we enable PCI DSS certification, and then you list all of the security capabilities that fall under the 12 requirements under the PCI DSS. And hopefully you haven't looked at the audit criteria, which expands out to maybe a couple hundred. But that's the kind of thing that you deal with. Now, that said, we're seeing hints of other kinds of programs. For example, OCP has got a couple of specs out now for storage devices. So there's a data center spec for SSDs, and there's a boot spec for SSDs. And if you look closely at those specs, there are pieces that kind of look like quasi-certification. So they hint at Fips 140, but don't require it for the crypto, and other pieces about things like vulnerability management and design, which kind of align with some of the stuff in common criteria. So it's not a formal program yet, but it's a hint of they want something. And this is not necessarily a unique situation. I mentioned the IoT labeling program in the US for consumer IoT. It's sort of dancing down the same path. They're not sure whether they want to do something formal with like common criteria. They want a quasi certification. So a lot of what I showed you earlier for these has some potential bearing on these other programs. You need to be thinking about risk and how you deal with it, right? Okay, so some conclusions here. So if this is something that's likely for one of your products, you really want to understand this early on, and you want to think through things like timing, how to localize the security, what's your customer going to need, what's the level kind of thing. Because those all are going to be important. They drive time, they drive cost, and the costs on these things are not trivial. When you're talking $250,000 per cert, you definitely want to be strategic, because the comment I've always had come back is, so what's the return on invested? And unfortunately, the conversation is, it's the barrier for entry. No cert, you don't play in this sector. Oh, how important do you consider that sector? Now, if you're forced to quantify that, that's a sort of tough, from a product manager perspective, a tough discussion to have. The product certification requirements, can definitely change significantly. We are seeing these new versions of the basic requirements for both Fips 140 and Common Criteria have both changed this year and in the last 6 months. And as I said, the Europeans are definitely making a lot of noise. I was on a call this morning with discussing, with the Cloud Security Alliance, some issues about what we're seeing in the European markets. They're definitely gonzo about dealing with get all the products certified and then we'll build on that. We know it doesn't solve all the problems. So if that's a market that you're worrying about, expect others will follow suit. Even China is definitely making some noises in this space. It's a convenient way to exclude certain products. Must have this criteria. Don't have it? Sorry, you can't play. All right. Make and model is important. So this timing is a huge issue. And this is a bit of a call to arms. We as vendors may have an opportunity to develop some of the requirements, like these collaborative protection profiles. I mentioned the IEEE is looking at it. This came out, there was a talk at the SNIA Storage Security Summit back in May. There's a session that was recorded. If you're interested in this, you might want to take a look at what that person had to say. He's the convener of the ISO committee that developed ISO 15408 and the 19790. So it's worth, certainly paying attention to it. Okay, so if you're down this path, and you're gonna sign up a lab, vet the lab before you fully engage them. Do they have what's gonna be needed to actually do what's required from a testing perspective? Or are they gonna throw this on your back? Check the pricing. Have they overinflated? Have they built too much contingency? Do they have too much fat? Figure out how they do their gap analysis. These are kinds of questions you wanna basically ask. Confirm how long it's gonna take for the entire process. Because some of them will, we're gonna start it in stages. Like, no. How long is this? Because there's some actual expectations for how long a certification program should take. And then equally important, when it's all done, who owns the project deliverables? Because you paid for them, you should get them. But if you don't have that in the contracts that you've done with the lab, they may say, this is all proprietary. And the reason that's significant is if you got to redo something, you don't have that work. You don't have that work product. So these are the kind of things that from just engaging a lab, you want to be very clear on, right? So I am pleased that you were here this morning for certifications. It's kind of a fuzzy-eyed kind of topic. But this is really intended to, as vendors, as developers, to think about whether this is important or not. If you're an actual developer, you might want to have this kind of conversation with your product manager, whether this is something you're going to worry about or not. And do take a moment to rate the session. Let us know whether this kind of content is useful to you or not. And thank you for your time. And that's the last question, I think. Yeah. In Fips 140-3, not that I'm aware of, but it has always been part of common criteria. So, I would actually be surprised if there wasn't a bit of a twist in there, because if there is some data that's actually in the module, I would expect that you need to basically make it go away at an appropriate time. But I don't remember seeing sanitize called out explicitly. But common criteria, it's been there for sure. Maybe, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much.